Hey warriors, real power doesn't introduce itself, it reveals itself slowly and only to those who are capable of recognizing it. The harsh truth is, what most people call power is nothing more than noise, visibility, and constant validation. But true power operates differently. It doesn't compete for attention, it withdraws from unnecessary exposure and becomes sharper in silence. The moment you stop trying to prove your value to everyone, you begin to understand something deeper. That influence is not about how much you are seen, but how much control you have over what others can see about you. And in that space, where others lose their presence, their voice and their reactions, real power quietly takes shape. Most people grow up believing that power is something external: status, loud confidence, dominance in conversations, or being constantly active and visible. They think the more they show up, the more powerful they become. But if that were true, then the most talkative, the most active, and the most socially visible individuals would always hold the strongest position. Reality doesn't follow that pattern. In the real world, power is often held by those who understand restraint, those who know when not to speak, those who observe instead of reacting, those who step back when others step forward, not out of weakness but out of strategy. Exile is not always something forced upon someone. Sometimes it is chosen deliberately. Silence is not always absence of thought. Sometimes it is the highest form of awareness. Because when you remove yourself from constant noise, you begin to see patterns clearly. You begin to understand people without revealing your own position. And in that clarity, control becomes easier, decisions become sharper, and reactions become intentional rather than emotional. In this video, you're going to uncover a perspective that most people never question: why stepping away can actually increase your influence, how silence can function as a strategic tool rather than a passive state, and why those who seem distant or withdrawn are often the ones operating with the highest level of control. We'll break down how exile can be used as a repositioning phase instead of a loss, how silence can strengthen your psychological edge, and how real power often comes from limiting what you reveal rather than expanding it. By the end, you won't just see power as dominance or visibility anymore. You'll start recognizing it as something far more powerful, subtle, far more calculated, and far more controlled than what most people are ever aware of. Now, I want to hear from you, warriors. Have you ever experienced a moment where stepping back, staying silent, or removing yourself from a situation actually gave you more clarity, respect, or control? Or do you still believe that being constantly visible and reactive is the real way to maintain power? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. Your experience might reveal a perspective that others haven't considered yet. Now, hold still for a moment. We are moving on to the main part. Point 1. The illusion of visible power. Now let's go deeper into something most people never question. What if everything you've been taught to associate with power is actually just an illusion? Because in today's world, visible confidence, loud communication, and constant presence are often mistaken for real authority. People assume that the one who speaks the most controls the situation, or the one who dominates the conversation holds the strongest position. But real power doesn't depend on how much you are seen reacting. It depends on how much you are able to observe without reacting. Think about it carefully and noted this point. When someone is constantly talking, constantly explaining, constantly trying to prove a point, what are they actually revealing? They're revealing their need for validation. They're revealing their emotional dependency on the situation. And unintentionally, they're giving away their internal state. Now compare that with someone who stays calm, who listens more than they speak, who chooses their words carefully and doesn't rush to respond to everything. That person is not losing power. That person is controlling information, controlling timing, and controlling perception. Because visible activity creates an illusion of strength, but controlled restraint creates actual influence. Here's the deeper layer most people miss. The more you try to appear powerful, the more you expose yourself to judgment, reaction, and resistance. But when you operate with quiet confidence, you reduce unnecessary friction and allow your presence to speak without forcing it. Real power is not measured by how much noise you create. It's measured by how much impact remains even when you say very little. And that's where the illusion breaks. Because what looks powerful on the surface is often just performance, while what feels subtle in reality is where actual control exists. Point 2. Exile as a strategic move. Now let's talk about something that most people misunderstand at a very deep level. That's exile. To the average person, exile feels like loss, like being pushed out, like losing relevance, connection, or control. But in reality, exile is not always imposed. In many cases, it is chosen deliberately by those who understand strategy. Because sometimes, stepping away is not retreat, it's repositioning. When you remove yourself from an environment, you are no longer distracted by noise, opinions, or emotional triggers. You are no longer reacting to every comment, every situation, every expectation. Instead, you enter a phase where observation becomes your primary tool. And here's where things start to shift. From a distance, patterns become clearer. People's true intentions become more visible. Situations that once felt confusing start to make sense. Because when you are inside the system, you are part of the reaction. But when you step outside the system, you gain perspective. This is why real power often involves temporary withdrawal, not because someone is weak, but because they understand the value of distance. Distance removes emotional interference. Distance allows clarity to develop. Distance gives you time to recalibrate your position without external pressure. And during this phase, something powerful happens quietly. You stop chasing validation. You stop responding impulsively. You stop depending on immediate feedback to define your state. Instead, you begin to rebuild internally. You refine your thinking. You strengthen your discipline. You realign your priorities without distractions. Most people don't recognize this as power because from the outside, it looks like inactivity. But internally, it's one of the most productive states a person can be in. Because when you eventually re-enter, you don't return with confusion. You return with clarity, control, and a stronger sense of direction. And at that point, your absence itself has already shifted perception. People start to notice what is no longer available. They start to value what they previously overlooked. So exile is not just about leaving a space, it's about transforming yourself in a space where no one is watching. And that transformation is where real leverage begins to build. Point 3. Silence as a weapon. Silence is often misunderstood as inaction or as a lack of confidence. But in reality, silence is one of the most advanced forms of control a person can develop. Because silence is not the absence of communication. It is the presence of awareness. When you stay silent in a situation where others expect a reaction, you are not losing power. You are withholding it. Every time you speak, you reveal information. Your tone reveals your emotions. Your words reveal your thinking. And your reactions reveal your level of control. But silence interrupts that pattern completely. It creates uncertainty in others. It makes your position harder to predict. And in human psychology, unpredictability naturally increases perceived authority. People are used to reading each other through responses. They expect immediate replies. They expect emotional reactions. They expect verbal confirmation. When those expectations are not met, they begin to adjust their behavior. This is where silence starts to function as a subtle form of influence. Because instead of you reacting to them, they begin to react to your absence of reaction. And in that shift, the balance of control quietly changes. Silence also forces observation. When you are not busy responding, defending, or explaining, you start noticing things you normally miss. Patterns in behavior, inconsistencies in speech, underlying intentions behind words. This level of awareness gives you an advantage that reactive people never develop. Reactive individuals are focused on immediate expression. They speak first and think later. They respond to emotion rather than analyzing the situation. But silence allows you to reverse that process. It gives you the space to think clearly before responding. It removes emotional interference from your decisions, and it helps you choose responses that are precise rather than impulsive. Over time, this builds internal discipline, because staying silent is not always easy. It requires restraint. It requires control over ego. It requires the ability to tolerate discomfort without rushing to fill it. Most people struggle with silence because they equate it with being ignored or being powerless. But those who understand its deeper role know that silence is not passive. It is active control. It allows you to step back mentally while still remaining fully aware of what is happening around you. It also changes how others perceive you. When someone does not react to everything, does not over-explain, and does not engage in unnecessary conversations, they start to appear more composed, more stable, and more self-contained. People begin to take their words more seriously. Because when you speak less, your words carry more weight. Silence creates contrast. In a world where most people are constantly talking, reacting, and expressing opinions, someone who remains calm and selective with their words naturally stands out, not because they are trying to, but because they are not trying too hard. And that lack of over-effort is often interpreted as confidence. So silence is not emptiness. It is a strategic space where awareness grows, control strengthens, and influence develops without force. It allows you to listen more than you speak, to observe more than you react, and to act with intention rather than impulse. And that is why silence, when used correctly, is not just a behavior. It becomes a weapon of precision, discipline, and quiet dominance. Point 4. What they hide now. At this point, you need to understand something deeper, something that connects all of this together. Real power is not just about what is shown, it is about what is intentionally hidden. Because those who truly understand power do not operate with full transparency. They operate with selective visibility. They reveal just enough to influence perception, but never enough to lose control. And this is where the idea becomes very close to what Niccolò Machiavelli described in political strategy, not morality, but reality. Machiavelli understood that in power dynamics, perception often matters more than truth, and that if everything is exposed, it becomes easier to predict, counter, and control you. So those who hold real influence tend to protect three things very carefully: their intentions, their emotions, and their long-term strategy. Because the moment your intentions are fully known, others can anticipate your moves. The moment your emotions are fully visible, others can manipulate your reactions. And the moment your strategy is fully exposed, others can prepare against you. So instead of revealing everything, powerful individuals create layers. What people see is not always the full picture. What people hear is often a filtered version of reality, and what people assume is usually shaped by perception, not truth. This is not deception in a simple sense. It is control over information, because information is power, and whoever controls the flow of information controls how they are perceived. Now think about your own behavior for a moment. How often do you feel the need to explain yourself? How often do you reveal your plans before they are complete? How often do you react in ways that expose your emotional state to others? In those moments, you are not just communicating, you are giving others access to your internal world. And once that access is given, it becomes easier for others to influence your decisions, whether directly or indirectly. This is why experienced individuals tend to stay reserved. They don't overshare. They don't rush to explain. They don't expose their full mindset in every interaction. Instead, they allow others to form incomplete assumptions, while they operate with full clarity internally. And this creates a psychological imbalance, because people feel they understand you, but in reality they don't have the full picture. That gap between perception and reality is where control exists. Machiavelli's perspective highlights something uncomfortable but very real. In competitive environments, being fully open can reduce your advantage, while controlled concealment can strengthen it. Not because you are hiding in fear, but because you are managing exposure strategically. When you reveal less, you maintain flexibility. When you reveal less, you remain unpredictable. And when you remain unpredictable, you are harder to influence. So what they hide is not necessarily something negative. It is often their strongest assets, their patience, their planning, their emotional control, their long-term thinking. These are not displayed openly because once they are visible, they lose their strategic value. And this is the final layer most people fail to recognize. Real power is not always about action. It is about restraint. Not everything is meant to be shown, not everything is meant to be explained, and not everything is meant to be understood immediately. Because sometimes the less others know about your process, the more control you maintain over your outcome. And that is where true power quietly exists. Not in visibility, but in what remains hidden behind it. Point 5. Power through perception. At this stage, you need to understand a principle that silently governs almost every interaction in life. Power is not just what you are. It is what others perceive you to be. Because in reality, people do not respond to absolute truth. They respond to perception. What they believe about you, what they assume about your position, what they interpret from your behavior. These factors shape how they treat you far more than your actual capabilities. This is where perception becomes a form of power. When your perception is strong, people hesitate before challenging you. When your perception is unclear, people feel comfortable testing your boundaries. And when your perception is weak, people subconsciously lower their level of respect. Now, here's the important part. Perception is not built through constant explanation. It is built through consistency, restraint, and controlled behavior. If you try too hard to prove who you are, you start weakening the very perception you are trying to create, because over-explaining often signals insecurity. Overreacting signals lack of control, and overexposure reduces mystery. On the other hand, when you remain composed, selective with your words, and consistent in your actions, people begin to form their own conclusions about you. And interestingly, those conclusions are often stronger than anything you could have said directly. This is why silence, distance, and controlled communication all connect back to perception. They allow others to interpret you without giving them full access. And in that interpretation, your image takes shape. If someone sees you as calm under pressure, they associate you with stability. If someone sees you as selective in communication, they associate you with depth. If someone sees you as unaffected by unnecessary noise, they associate you with self-control. None of these traits need to be declared verbally. They are communicated through behavior. And that behavior, repeated over time, becomes your identity in the eyes of others. Now think about how quickly perception can change based on your reactions. One impulsive response can shift how someone sees your composure. One emotional outburst can alter how they interpret your stability. One unnecessary explanation can weaken the authority you've built. That is how fragile perception can be, but also how powerful it is when managed correctly, because once a strong perception is established, it starts to work in your favor automatically. People begin to approach you differently. They begin to listen more carefully. They begin to think twice before crossing certain boundaries. Not because you forced them, but because your perceived presence influences their behavior. This is why real power is often quiet but consistent. It doesn't rely on constant demonstration. It relies on maintaining an image that aligns with control, discipline, and awareness. And when perception aligns with your internal state, you no longer need to convince others of your position. They begin to recognize it on their own. That is the point where influence becomes natural and power becomes stable. Point 6. Why withdrawal increases respect. At this level, one of the most misunderstood moves in human behavior is withdrawal. Most people interpret withdrawal as losing interest, or as a sign that someone is giving up. But in reality, strategic withdrawal often does the opposite. It creates value, because human psychology is deeply influenced by scarcity. When something is always available, it becomes easy to overlook. When someone is constantly present, their presence starts to feel normal. And when there is no distance, there is little room for appreciation to develop. But the moment you step back, something shifts. Your absence becomes noticeable, your presence becomes remembered, and your value starts to be reassessed. This is not because you changed who you are, but because perception adjusts when access is limited. When you're always around, people stop making an effort to understand your absence. But when you withdraw, they are forced to notice what is no longer there. And in that absence, reflection begins. They start comparing how things were with how they are now. They start recognizing the role you played more clearly. And sometimes they begin to realize your importance only after your presence is reduced. This is where respect often increases, not because you demanded it, but because your absence created a contrast that highlighted your value. Now, withdrawal is not about disappearing randomly or avoiding responsibility. It is about controlling your availability with intention. When you are always accessible, you give others unlimited access to your time, attention, and energy. But when you regulate that access, you shift the dynamic. People begin to understand that your presence is not guaranteed, and anything that is not guaranteed is naturally valued more. This is a subtle but powerful psychological principle. Scarcity increases attention, absence creates curiosity, distance builds appreciation, and together these elements reshape how others perceive you. At the same time, withdrawal also benefits you internally. It gives you space to reset, to detach from emotional dependency, to evaluate situations without external pressure. When you are constantly engaged, your thinking becomes reactive. But when you step back, your thinking becomes strategic. You are no longer responding to everything immediately. You are observing, processing, and deciding with clarity. This internal shift reflects externally as well, because when you return from a period of withdrawal, your energy, your communication, and your presence often feel different. More composed, more grounded, more intentional, and people can sense that difference, even if they cannot explain it. That is why withdrawal, when used correctly, does not weaken your position. It strengthens it. It creates space for both perception and self-development to evolve, and over time it reinforces a simple but powerful truth. Respect is not always gained by constant presence. Sometimes it is earned through the ability to step back, maintain control, and let absence speak for itself. Point 7. The real nature of power. Now, when you bring everything together, exile, silence, hidden intentions, perception, and withdrawal, a deeper pattern starts to emerge. Because real power is not built on a single action. It is built on a combination of internal control and external discipline. At its core, power is not about dominating others. It is about mastering yourself. The first layer is control over emotions. If your emotions control your reactions, then others can indirectly influence your decisions. But when you are able to remain steady under pressure, your reactions become intentional instead of impulsive. The second layer is control over information. What you reveal, when you reveal it, and how much you reveal, all of it shapes how others perceive and respond to you. Selective communication is not secrecy for the sake of hiding. It is strategy for maintaining balance. The third layer is control over timing. Not every moment requires a response. Not every situation requires immediate action. Understanding when to act and when to wait is a critical element of real influence. When these three elements come together, emotional discipline, information control, and timing, you begin to operate at a level that most people don't consciously recognize. Because at that point, you are no longer reacting to circumstances, you are navigating them. And this is where Machiavelli's perspective becomes relevant again. He emphasized that in matters of power, appearances often matter as much as reality. Not because reality is unimportant, but because people respond to what they can see and interpret. So real power exists in the alignment between your internal state and your external behavior. Internally, you're calm, aware, and strategic. Externally, you present yourself in a way that maintains stability, control, and clarity. When these two are aligned, your presence becomes consistent. And consistency builds trust in perception. People begin to feel that you are predictable in the right way. Not in a way that exposes your next move, but in a way that signals reliability and control. This reduces unnecessary conflict. It minimizes emotional turbulence, and it allows you to operate without constantly defending or explaining yourself. At this level, power becomes quiet but stable. You are not trying to prove anything. You are not chasing validation. And you are not dependent on external approval to feel in control. Instead, your strength comes from within, and it reflects outward naturally. This is why real power often appears subtle. Because it is not forced, it is not exaggerated, it is not constantly displayed, it is maintained through discipline, awareness, and restraint. And once you understand this, your perspective begins to shift. You start to realize that power is not about being the loudest voice in the room. It is about having the ability to remain composed when everything around you is not. It is about knowing when to engage, when to withdraw, when to speak, and when to stay silent. And most importantly, it is about understanding that control over yourself is the foundation upon which all other forms of influence are built. Because without self-control, no external strategy can remain stable. But with self-control, even the simplest actions can carry significant impact. That is the real nature of power. Not visible dominance, but internal mastery expressed through calculated presence. Point 8. Mastery of self, the foundation of real power. At this point, everything leads to one unavoidable truth. No strategy, no perception, no silence, and no withdrawal can sustain real power if you do not first master yourself. Because self-mastery is not just a concept. It is the control center of every decision you make. Most people try to gain power by changing their external environment. They adjust their behavior depending on the situation. They react differently based on who they are talking to. They seek approval, validation, or recognition from outside sources. But that approach is unstable. Because when your behavior is controlled by external triggers, your power becomes dependent on circumstances you cannot fully control. Real power begins when your internal state is no longer easily disturbed by external events, when you are not easily provoked, when you are not quick to react emotionally, when you are able to pause, observe, and choose your response consciously. That pause is where mastery begins, because in that moment you are no longer reacting on impulse. You are acting with awareness. Self-mastery requires discipline over your emotions. Not suppression, but regulation. You acknowledge what you feel, but you do not allow those feelings to dictate your actions immediately. This is a subtle but critical difference. Without this control, silence becomes forced. Withdrawal becomes avoidance, and strategic behavior becomes inconsistent. But with self-mastery, all of these elements align naturally. Silence becomes intentional, withdrawal becomes strategic, and your presence becomes stable regardless of the environment. Another important aspect of self-mastery is consistency, not just in actions, but in identity. When your internal values remain stable, your behavior becomes predictable in a positive way. People begin to trust your composure because it does not fluctuate with every situation. This consistency builds credibility over time, and credibility is one of the strongest forms of influence. At the same time, self-mastery also means understanding your limitations, knowing when to engage and when to step back, knowing what is worth your energy and what is not, knowing which battles to fight and which ones to ignore. Because not every situation deserves your reaction, and not every opinion deserves your attention. Those who lack self-mastery often feel the need to respond to everything. They are driven by ego, urgency, or emotional discomfort. But those who have developed control over themselves operate differently. They conserve energy. They prioritize clarity over reaction. They choose long-term stability over short-term satisfaction. And this mindset creates a deeper form of strength. Because when you are not controlled by impulses, you gain the ability to think beyond the immediate moment. You begin to make decisions based on outcomes rather than emotions. You begin to respond with intention rather than habit. And you begin to carry yourself with a level of composure that others can sense, even without explanation. This is where real authority starts to form internally, not through dominance, but through balance. Balance between emotion and logic. Balance between action and restraint. Balance between presence and absence. When this balance is achieved, power no longer feels like something you are chasing. It becomes something that naturally follows your behavior. Because people are drawn to stability, people respect consistency, and people trust those who are in control of themselves. So self-mastery is not just another point in this discussion. It is the core principle that connects everything. Without it, silence becomes empty. Exile becomes confusion, and perception becomes unstable. But with it, every element we've discussed becomes aligned, intentional, and effective. And that is where real power truly begins. So when you step back and look at everything together, real power was never about being the loudest voice, the most visible presence, or the one who reacts the fastest. It was always about control. Control over your emotions, control over your reactions, control over what you reveal and what you keep hidden. Exile taught you perspective. Silence taught you restraint. Perception showed you how others interpret you. And self-mastery tied everything together into a stable foundation. Because at the end of the day, those who truly understand power are not the ones constantly trying to prove it. They are the ones who can step away without losing themselves, remain silent without feeling weak, and stay composed even when everything around them is unpredictable. Real power is calm. Real power is calculated. And real power is consistent. It doesn't need to announce itself, because its presence is already felt through behavior, discipline, and awareness. So the question is not whether power exists. The real question is whether you are developing the kind of control that allows you to hold it. Now, I want you to reflect on this and answer honestly. Where in your life are you reacting too quickly instead of observing? Where are you revealing too much instead of maintaining control? And where could silence, distance, or patience actually give you an advantage? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might help someone else see this from a different perspective. If you found value in this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more deep insights like this. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss future content. Stay aware, stay disciplined, and remember, real power is not about being seen. It's about being in control, even when no one is watching.